Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Hello, Reclaimers. Thais Sky here. Welcome to the podcast. I've been silent the past 2 weeks here on the podcast because I've been really focused on listening and supporting and paying attention to what's happening in our country right now. And I felt like it was time to get out of my silence because I wanted to share some thoughts as a white Latinx woman on navigating anti-racism. Now, if you have been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you know that anti-racism is a fundamental value of Reclaim and of my work, and whether it's coaching or Worthy Women Rise, anti-racism is a really core foundational element of my work. And I've used this podcast to share my own journey of waking up to my whiteness and my white privilege in hopes that it will support all of you non-Black listeners in grappling with your own unconscious biases, right? Like our own, the ways that we have perpetuated racist systems. And so I wanted to do that here, given that the last time I really dove into my own experience of navigating anti-racism was a year or so ago when Lindsay and I recorded the final part of the You're Waking Up to Your White Privilege, Now What? So that is a 5-part series that my friend Lindsay Ray and I recorded where we dove into what it was like to awaken to our white privilege really while it was happening. And at the point when we started recording that series, I think we were about 9 months into the conversation. And then we recorded that series over a course of a few months. All of that can be found in the show notes for you to listen to. But it's been a while since those episodes. And so this is kind of a part 6. So if you want to think about it that way, or just updates, of what has been really supportive and helpful for me in making sure that anti-racism is a sustainable core element of my work and of my life. Because I think that, when something like this is happening in our country, it can be very easy to kind of get activated and take actions to, we're kind of encouraged on social media. There's a lot of noise happening right now. So there's a huge emphasis on donating and protesting, putting our bodies on the line, or putting money, time, resources on the line. But eventually this will fade. We don't know when. We don't know what's going to happen when that happens, but eventually things are going to go to a new normal, hopefully one where police brutality is diminished, if not completely eradicated, though I think maybe that's wishful thinking. But certainly let's hope that significant police reform, defunding police, abolishing police really happens as a consequence of these protests. There's still a lot of work to do, though, right? I mean, we haven't even touched yet on education. We haven't touched yet on trans lives. We haven't touched on so many other systems where racism is a part of, because there is no system in this country that racism isn't a part. And so we have a lot of work to do. And it's important that we make sure that our participation in it is sustainable as non-Black folks, as non-Black humans. Because that's what's going to ultimately drive the engine of change, is sustainable action. This is so true when we're talking about interpersonal relationships or even intrapersonally within ourselves. Healing work is a marathon. It is not a sprint. You don't just go into intensive work for a few months and then expect that your life will be significantly better forever. It requires consistent tweaks, consistent evaluations, consistent work to make life consistently different, consistently better. That consistently is key, and therefore it is important to make sure that we're grounded in sustainability. So that's what I want to talk to you all about, that sustainability, about creating that sustainability, because that has been really important for me in making sure that everything I do is coming from a lens of anti-racism, rather than just kind of showing up on social media in a performative sort of way and then going back to the way things were. The going back to is a form of gaslighting. It's a form of violence in a way. It can really hurt the very humans that we just spent a minute defending. And so, okay, so let's talk about this. Where do I want to start? I think, I want to name that when the first maybe year and a half, 2 years of awakening to my whiteness and my white privilege, there was a lot of rage, a burning rage, a burning fire that felt really critical for me to tap into. And I've been navigating my own relationship with anger and rage since then, because waking up to whiteness and to racism sparked within me a pool of rage and anger that I hadn't touched, that is very important to heal and to process, because anger is so informative. Anger tells us where our boundaries have been violated, and my boundaries were violated consistently as a child. And so anger is very hard to sometimes access because we've learned how to dissociate from anger. And so bringing back anger is a really important part of the healing process. And so I'm very, very grateful to have developed this new understanding of my rage and my anger. And rage, anger aren't sustainable. They're fires, right? And as fires, it's important to bring them out when the circumstance calls for it. But we don't want to rely on rage and anger forever. Does that make sense? We don't want to be banking on rage and anger to sustain us, because it's not a sustainable emotion. We want to be anchoring our work in anti-racism not on the inconsistency of anger and rage, but on something deeper, more sustainable. And for me, that has been love. When we do things out of love, we can access an endless pool, an endless reserve of energy, time, money that can't be reserved, can't be sustained in anger. Not to say that anger and love are mutually exclusive. You can be doing something out of love and out of anger. That's valid. That's true. But once the anger fades, can we access the love that is underneath and use that as the driving force for our action? And this feels like a really important way of thinking about the difference between obligation and love. When we do something out of obligation, whether it's because people are telling us we have to on social media, there is a part of that collective shaming that is useful. Shame is one of those really tricky things that I think it's really quick to dismiss it as not helpful. I know I've certainly have made comments about that. I don't know. It's not that it's not helpful. It's that we don't want to stay there. We don't want to land in shame and let shame prevent us from going deeper. There is something about collective shame that does work, at least in the short term. And so, while initially obligation, which tends to stem from shame, can be useful in the spark of the waking up, when you throw your trash out your car window and then you look inside the car and everybody in the car is kind of giving you an angry face and telling you that was unacceptable, and they kind of shame you in that way. That can be really useful in making sure you don't do that again. But we don't want to land in that shame, and we don't want to use shame as the only tool in our disposal, because it's not going to create the lasting, sustainable changes. And so, so there's a sense of mild obligation that can be useful, but for the most part, things that come out of obligation tend to then build resentment. Things that come out of obligation tend to be short-lived. It tends to be half-assed. It's just not the most grounded way in which we can be engaging in this work. Whereas I think what's more useful than obligation is, like I said, to be tapping into a love for humanity. That is what has been true for me in anti-racism work. Waking up to my white privilege, while it was deeply painful, it also showed me a capacity to see other humans that were having lived experiences differently than me in such a more profound way. And I'm not just talking about Black people. I'm talking actually about all people, because we all carry marginalized identities and we all carry oppressive identities. Most of us anyway. I don't want to say all. But there tends to be privileges on a spectrum. And so you'll probably fall somewhere on the spectrum. And therefore, there are people who are going to have less privilege than you. And being able to see people who have less privilege, being able to really, really recognize their lived experience is a profound connection it's a profound intimacy to the human experience that I think is just so full and so powerful. And that's the joy, that's the gift of this work. I am not an anti-racist out of obligation because it's what the good white thing is to do. I advocate and I participate and I choose to be anti-racist every single day because it allows me to create a body of work. It allows me to create a way of living that encompasses the diversity of the human experience. Whiteness is so tremendously boring because in whiteness, I just clapped there in enthusiasm. In whiteness, we are limited in what is possible. We are limited in creativity. We are limited in colonizing and stealing what is not ours. When we can access what is ours and give space for other people to access what is theirs, there is such a gift in that. There is such a gift in that. And so from the time that I, woke up to my privileges to now, what has been really important for me is to tap into that love. I am not saying that it is necessarily the easiest thing, just in that as a white person, complacency is the easiest route, right? To become complacent, to be kind of seen as that's their problem, not my problem, because I benefit from white privilege. I benefit from not having to look at racism. I benefit in being able to kind of push that aside because it's not a part of how I show up in the world. I am not judged by the color of my skin. I'm not persecuted in that way. I'm not afraid if I get pulled over. If a cop pulls me over, right, I'm annoyed. I'm frustrated. I'm upset that I'm now going to have to pay a hefty fine, but I'm not thinking, am I going to live? And that is not only a tremendous privilege, but it's also very confronting to really sit with the fact that some of our brothers and sisters, the people of this world, are having that experience. It can be confronting, and so it's easier to not look at it. So I'm not saying that love is necessarily the easiest choice, but it is the most grounding choice, because as we continue to move into love and do things out of love, we start to but we continue to investigate our own healing. And so it elevates all of us when things are done out of love. That has been really important for me. The other thing that has been really important for me throughout the years is to really plug into my nervous system and recognize what it means to be connected to my nervous system. And here's something that I've seen online, and I've participated online. Trust me, I am not separate from this. This is a continual learning for me. But, when the protests started to happen, there was a lot of conversations on social media about what the actions that can be taken on social media that is going to create the most impactful change. There's different platforms for change, and social media, we cannot deny, is one of those platforms where change can happen, and there's a tremendous power in social media. And so, the Blackout Tuesday experience was one where there was this idea to black out your blocks, black out your feed, use the hashtag Black Lives Matter to show your solidarity for Black people. But what it ended up ultimately doing was it fed the hashtag, which many people use as a resource for understanding where protests are happening and what is the advocacy work that people are doing. It now was blacked out, right? It was now inundated with black squares, and it made it harder for people to find that really important information. And so once people started doing Blackout Tuesday, a lot of advocates and activists started speaking out that this was actually counterproductive and that wasn't helpful. Now, if we had slowed down and really grounded in our nervous system and really thought things through, I think the response would have been that it wouldn't make sense to black out our social media. That maybe there could have been another way to make that of use. So at least not have used the hashtag Black Lives Matter. But when our nervous system is activated, when we're in fight flight, it can be very difficult for us to have the thinking capacities turned on. Our brain turns off the thinking capacities when we're in fight flight and we're just thinking about survival. And while, of course, now we're not in survival mode, we're not talking necessarily about survival because death isn't a part of the conversation of posting on social media. Our nervous system doesn't know that. And so our nervous system is responding as if it were a matter of life and death. When our nervous system is that activated, we're not thinking things through. And what's really important and has been really important for me and will continue to be really important for me, because I am, again, like I said, not an expert at this. It's just this is an awakening that I've been munching on and I want to continue to work on, is I want my nervous system plugged into my higher thinking capacities when I'm thinking about and engaging in and talking about anti-racism. I want to be able to bring my full self. I want to be able to practice discernment. I want to be able to think things through. And so what's been really important for me is when my nervous system is activated to tend to that so that I can then show up. And the cool thing is with the healing work, there's such parallels between doing our healing work, our internal healing work, and the healing work in our society. There's so many parallels, because as we do our own healing work of understanding our nervous system, understanding what gets activated when, understanding our unconscious world, understanding our childhood, when we put those pieces together, we're more aware of when our nervous system is activated in the world. And as non-white people, and actually non-Black people, and I'm going to speak specifically as a white person. And I want to speak specifically as a white person because I'm thinking right now of Amy Cooper, the woman in Central Park who threatened Christian Cooper that she was going to call 911 because he asked her to put the dog on a leash. In those moments, her nervous system was activated because of her, unconscious biases, maybe conscious biases. I can't speak to her, but white people, we must name that part of our bias against Black people is that Black people are dangerous, particularly Black men are dangerous. This has been a narrative that's embedded in the American system. In fact, as I talked about in Waking Up to White Privilege, the first first few laws that were created in the United States were about the inability for interracial couples between white women and black men. White men did this in naming it. They were protecting white women from black men. So the narrative that black men are dangerous, and that it is that white woman will be protected by the white man has been a part of the cultural narrative since the very beginning, right? So, of course, our nervous system, whether we want to or not, are going to be activated until we do the work of tending to and deactivating and learning to trust ourselves and learning, unpacking these biases that black men are dangerous. It's really important work that we do this because, as we have seen with Amy Cooper, she is not the first. She is not the last. This has been going on for centuries. White women, have been a participant of white supremacy in a really dangerous way. And I'm saying that out of a knowing of my participation in that. And I want to make sure that I'm not separating whiteness from me. I am white, and therefore I have that tendency within me. I've never acted out on those tendencies, but I can see my closeness to, my proximity to whiteness may elicit my nervous system to respond in a similar way to Amy Cooper. So what am I trying to say? Doing the work of tending to our nervous system, of taking deep breaths, of creating space between the action and the reaction gives us the capacity to respond. What's amazing about this is that this is embedded in spiritual practices and spiritual teachings that have endured thousands of years. The Buddhist tradition talks in so much about the capacity for us to hold ourselves so that we respond rather than react. The more that we can embrace the messy, dirty, yucky parts of ourselves, the more we can ultimately create a spaciousness to respond rather than react. When we respond, it means that we're plugged in. It means that we're able to think things through. It means that we're not doing this out of guilt and out of shame, which is stemming from so much of nervous system activation. And we're actually choosing to respond in a very intentional way. It has been such a theme in my life right now, this capacity to think things through, to really think about something, whether it's to make sense of something with somebody else or to be thinking about things through myself. This has been really important for me because I see so often that the ways in which I react are not coming from my whole self. They're coming from the parts of me that are scared, the parts of me that are limited, the parts of me that are activated. And I don't want to be reacting in my life in that way. So it's been really important for me, especially these past 2 weeks, to be really thinking things through. And, in all transparency here, I didn't participate in the Blackout Tuesday because of that thinking things through, because I didn't react. But I participated in the muting of myself from a space of reaction, from a space of not wanting to be seen as of not wanting to be seen in a certain way. And that is really interesting, right? The ways in which, our value when we're talking about anti-racism as white women tend to be on how we're perceived versus what is right and what is true and what is important, right? That's, again, it's that obligation versus love. And I didn't want to not participate and then be perceived as any certain way, as centering myself, as being racist, as not being supportive of the Black community. And so I muted myself for the week from a reactive point. I'm not saying that muting yourself was the wrong thing to do. Many people, I imagine, chose to mute themselves from a space of responsiveness. I'm just naming that for me, it was a place out of reactivity and a concern more about what people were thinking of me than what felt really right for me at that time. So for me, it was performative. So I'm not saying that the muting thing was performative. I'm just saying that it was for me. I wish I'd given myself more time to really think it through. And I think ultimately, if I had given myself more time to think things through, I would have chosen differently. Because I think that there were different ways that I could have used my platform in that week that may have been more in alignment with what felt right for me. Again, not speaking for anybody else or anybody's participation. And I'm not speaking about the founders of that challenge. I think that I'm not speaking of any value about that. I think that I'm just speaking about me personally. So I'm sharing this because I want that transparency of like, oh, this is just another white woman figuring out. I am not an expert. I'm certainly not an anti-racist educator. I hope you didn't come onto this podcast thinking that I was. I've made it abundantly clear throughout my podcast I'm not. In fact, I have featured on my podcast incredible anti-racism educators, Black women who are doing, this really important work. I will link some of them or all of them on the show notes for you to go. Right off the top of my head, I'm thinking about Andrea Renee. I'm thinking about Rachel Ricketts. Their entire body of work is about supporting people, non-Black people, figure this out and wake up to this. So go support them, go pay them. They are doing incredible labors of love. They love doing this. They're doing this out of just a desire of awakening the world. I think it's a really beautiful work that they're doing. So go support them. I'm just sharing my own experience in hopes that you can see that, listen, we are all figuring this out together. No one has any answers. Literally, no one has any answers. And this idea that there is a right or wrong is what drives the nervous system to shut down because of this real embedded sense within us that we want to be good, that we want to be right. And I've talked about this a lot in my series, You're Waking Up to Your White Privilege, Now What? So you can go listen to that. That's also in the show notes. So let's talk more a little bit about continual updates. What have I learned over the 4 years now that I've been doing this work? Really grounding in my nervous system and really being able to think things through has been really important for me. Recognizing the ways that I have been complacent, the ways that I, have navigated this imperfectly has been really important for me. I just want to really name that, like, I haven't landed. I haven't arrived. It's really disorienting. I'm not going to lie, to go on social media this week and to see, big names in industry, names that, I have literally watched over the years be called out for their non-anti-racism stance. Like they in their whiteness, right, in their privilege, they didn't see what they didn't see, and they were being called out on it. There's a woman who did a whole big launch of a program that she had to ultimately shut down because it was so problematic and she got called out. And to have had that woman say that she's going to now not look at this, and then now putting up all these posts on social media about how with Black people she is, without any sort of atonement, without any sort of naming of the imperfect process, without any sort of naming of the people who did the emotional labor of waking her up. I think that there's something really gaslighty about that. And listen, I get we're all figuring this out as non-Black humans. There is no perfect way. I just said that. I do think, though, that it's really important for us, if we're talking about this, to be talking about it from a space of learning instead of a space of arrival. Because we're basically erasing the labor that has taken in order for us to get to this point. If it's hard to wrap your mind around this, maybe it's easier to think about this from a gender dynamic. If you had spent years and years and years, helping a man kind of understand, why it's kind of wrong and bad to, objectify women. And now suddenly he's just talking about how wrong it is to objectify women and not talking about that process that it's been for him. It feels quite disorienting. And, may I add, in the name of transparency, I certainly did this. I certainly, when I was waking up, acted as if I knew everything. Again, because the nervous system is activated, because you don't want to appear wrong. You don't want to appear bad. You don't want to appear like you're just waking up now, because if you're just waking up now, it means that you've been doing harm. And that's really, really confronting. Really confronting. Totally get that. And more people will benefit from watching you share your learnings, share your mistakes, share how you're going to do better and how you're doing better and who has supported you than you pretending like you already know. I guarantee it because I have been observing of it. I have watched it. It's beautiful. It is beautiful how many more white women are waking up to this now more than ever before. I mean, everybody that I look, any big name in industry that I've looked, they're talking about their awakening. That is really cool. But let's make sure that we're really naming the journey and the people who have supported us on the journey. For me, it has been Alexis Morgan. It has been Andrea Renee. It has been Desiree Adaway, Erica Hines. I featured them all on my podcast in various times because I am indebted to these women for doing the labor. Some unbeknownst to them, they've just been themselves and posting online of waking me up, and I'm really appreciative of them. Okay. Final really, really important thing that I want to talk about and name. And that is, what has been really helpful for me and continues to be really helpful for me is to ground in what role I want to play. And really be thinking about anti-racism as a lifelong commitment. And in that lifelong commitment, what is my role? Now, this has been particularly highlighted through a really cool framework that a participant in Worthy Women Rise shared with me. Actually, let me look it up right now because I want to share this resource with you all. Okay, the Instagram account is Building Movement Project. And if you go to their Instagram link, it will send you a link, a PDF to their ecosystem map. And the cool thing about their ecosystem map is that it highlights various different roles that one can play in social change. So they list out weavers, guides, storytellers, healers, disruptors, caregivers, builders, visionaries, frontline responders, experimenters. This is really cool. You can go get the PDF and it will give you a list of questions for you to be thinking about and asking yourself in terms of what is your role? What of those feel really most called for you? And it defines those roles as well. And that's important to know. What I love about that is when we're grounded in what we're willing to do, it eradicates the question of what can we do. And this is something that comes from Erica Hart and Ebony, which Erica Hart I've also had on the podcast. Erica Hart does a lot of really wonderful, important work around this topic as well as sex education. But Erica Hart and Ebony on their Instagram was talking about the question of what can I do, which is a question that white women ask a lot. What can I do? What can I do? I don't know what to do. It can be very overwhelming to know, like, what is our role? And what has been useful for me is that because I know that this is a lifestyle, this is a part of my life, grounding in, like, what am I willing to do with my time, with my resources, with my money, with my energy, where I am rooted. I am rooted here. What is the most impact I can make here? Because we can make the most impact where we are rooted. So for me, I see myself as a healer and a guide, and the way to define healers are I recognize and tend to the generational and current traumas caused by oppressive systems, institutions, policies, and practices, and then guides are defined as I teach, counsel, and advise using my gifts of well-earned discernment and wisdom. I'm also, I think, a dash of disruptor, which is I take uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo, to raise awareness, and to build power. And I feel like I really do that in my own little way here on the podcast. But anyway, so that's important for me to know because it means that it's going to be really critical for me to continue to learn how to hold trauma-informed healing space for non-white folks and to be comfortable in complexity and nuance. I do a lot of work on a one-on-one and in Worthy Women Rise, in my group program. And so in what ways am I making sure that I'm continuing to learn, continuing to unpack, continuing to better myself, and also be educated so that I can hold the most potent space for people, so that my program is healing for the non-white participants. Healing means being able to meet people where they're at. That is a fundamental core sense for me in healing. And so the more I do my own work, the more I can see people without my stuff getting in the way, right? A radical act of love, as I talked about at the beginning. So that's helpful for me. That is so helpful for me. It's also helpful for me to look at, my finances and determine how much of my finances do I want to commit to the cause. And look at it not from like a chunk of money, but from a monthly, reoccurring commitment. The other thing that's really helpful for me is, what my time right now, or another is who am I surrounding myself with? If I surround myself with my family, how am I making sure that my values are being very made clear in those dynamics? Those are all ways that we can really make change where we are rooted. You may feel called to be a part of policy creation. You may feel a call to be a part of something because you're really good at it. Maybe you're really good at writing and it's very easy for you to write policy, or maybe it's, really easy for you to be spending a large swath of your time on social media doing conversations there. I mean, there's so many different ways you can contribute. You don't have to be at the protests in order to contribute. And if you feel called to be at the protests, wonderful, right? We all have a role to play in the revolution. We all have a role to play in the changing of this planet. And we get to ground ourselves in what role feels right for me. That has felt really right for me, particularly in the past few weeks, to make sure that the ways that I'm looking at this is coming from a really full space and not just a reactivity. While we are called to action, particularly now, and I want to show up really powerfully now for the cause, I also want to make sure that the work that I'm doing is going to be sustainable and going to be continuing in the long term. Finally, something that's been really important for me to grapple with, to explore, and to settle into is recognizing the power of rest. Again, we're going to talk about activated nervous systems. When we are in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, whatever response we're in that feels involuntary and unconscious, one of the most profound ways that we can tend to ourselves is to give ourselves space for rest. And so we are invited to find a balance between resting and recognizing that our action is important. This is a tricky balance that we each must find within ourselves. We are not going to be told the answers to these questions. I can't tell you the answer to this question because this is a profound inquiry of like, are you really feeling like you're showing up from your fullness, or are you depleted and exhausted and mentally overwhelmed? Because while we want to be showing up powerfully, recognizing that doing so when we're burnt out is not useful. And as I've talked about in Your Waking Up to White Privilege, self-care was co-opted by the movements of the 60s, the civil rights and words. Particularly, it stemmed from Black, lesbian, feminist writers. This idea of self-care for Black people to not burn out in their protesting and in their revolution. This is not a Black issue. This is a human issue. We all must rally together to support our Black brothers and sisters, those who are fighting for their lives. We, as with our privilege, are invited to step in and participate and take some of the weight off of their shoulders because they're not responsible for changing the system. We are, because we created the system. Having said that, finding a way to infuse rest, to infuse care, to infuse a way to support ourselves is the best way to make this work sustainable. Again, everything about this episode is about sustainability. It's about making this be an active part of your life. And so in the name of sustainability, how are you making sure that you are giving yourself rest? I love the NAP ministry. I have preached about them before. The NAP ministry is an incredible movement of activating rest. Their reminders are really, really potent. Like one day ago, they wrote, "You don't have to earn rest." Yes. Another is, What kind of future is even available to us? Are we ready to embrace a liberated future for all? What are we willing to give up and give? We will rest. What will we need to truly rest and make space for others to do so? Are y'all even prepared to hold space for sustained justice and liberation for others? Do you even care for yourself in a way that could make space for others to experience care? Ooh, these are such important questions to be sitting with. Let's see. The global truth about what white supremacy has done to us on a systemic and spiritual level is true and real no matter who wants to deny it. We are exhausted, disconnected, and overworked. We are surviving in a capitalist system that sees people or profit over people. Rest is a disruption. Rest is a resistance. Okay, so talked about rest before. I will continue to talk about rest, finding ways to rest, all of us, no matter our role. Rest must be a part of that conversation. Making sure, of course, that it is in integrity with what you know is your action. You'll know if your rest is coming out of a desire to not speak up, not show up, not play your role. You'll know because it will feel out of integrity. And that's the beautiful thing about doing embodiment work and feeling into our relationship with our body, is that it becomes easier for us to attune into whether we are choosing rest or choosing to opt out. May we remember that we need to be opting in, that we are needed. All of us are needed. And change, is required. We must change. These systems must come down. We must burn it all down and build something that is sustainable for all. Because when we destroy white supremacy systems and capitalistic systems, we create space where all of us can thrive and all of us can have space and resources that is necessary for a full and abundant life. And we are so deserving of that. All of us humans are. Okay, so that's all that I have to share. I hope that this was useful to you. I will be on Instagram continuing to talk about this, so go find me there at I am Thais Sky. I'm sending all of you all my love as we maintain, keeping the fight. We're all needed, so let's show up.
Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.